Okay, so now let's introduce Fergie Miller. He is the UK Smart Cities Lead at EIT Digital. Hi, Fergie. Maybe you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, Gemma. Thank you very much. I work on the Smart Cities portfolio at EIT Digital. I support startups around about Series A, so we help you raise your first growth round of sort of typically 1 to 10 million euros or dollars, and access markets overseas. I also work on our consortium brokerage with our partners in the smart city arena. We've got, for the first panel today, we're focusing on business development, which in my opinion is almost the #1 priority for any business. I'd like to ask, we've got 3 great startups being represented here today. So I'd like to ask up Tom, Priya and Josh to come and get mic'd. And we're going to spend about 45 minutes talking about business development. So hopefully you'll come away with an idea of how some successful startups have done that already. Look, while they're getting mic'd up, one of the things we want to achieve today is to try and make the room as interactive as possible. Was everyone given a number when they came in? No? No? Okay, we're going to do it by rows then. We thought it would be a nice idea to give everyone who wanted the opportunity to stand up and speak for 30 seconds to do so. If you don't, it's not obligatory at all, but it's a nice opportunity for people in the room to get an idea of what you're doing so they can come up and approach you in between sessions. So we'll start off with the front row and work our way back, if that's okay. Just if you could just spend a moment introduce yourself, saying what you do, and perhaps why you're here, that would be fantastic.
I'm Andrew Ross from Global Garden, developing a green bond for London, providing finance across whole sectors that in aggregation add up to a significant reduction in climate change. For low change Greece, we've got to be spending $1 trillion a year. The bond markets can't find the project. I'm here to find it.
Thank you, thank you. We don't have the numbers actually, so we're just going very road. Do you just want to introduce yourself again, or you?
Okay, I can. Okay, my name is Stefano Bonfa. I'm from Oxford Sustainable Development. I'm just developing a new startup related with how to exploit the data satellite. Keep in mind that the satellite we have about 30 years of images that has not been exploited, now are open, and how you can, let's say, implement in a smart strategy concept of smart cities.
Great, thank you, thank you. Would you like to stand up?
Hello, my name is Alina. I'm from EMEA. I guess we are a scale-up. We have a platform which can get all the data from buildings and energy, water, transportation, and any other resources that a building or a community is using. Compare the data and do some very clever stuff with it to bring the analytics out, cutting down on manual time, inefficiencies that a lot of people have around having their data in Excel and having data dispersed around different systems. So IoT and energy efficiency. Thank you.
My name is Isabella. I'm the Changify head, which is a platform that creates an integration around sustainability and change and innovation. And I'm personally very interested in finding ideas and solutions around air pollution problem in London, so this is why I'm here today.
Hello everyone, my name is Prakesh. I'm from India. I'm working on projects which will improve and actually calculate sanitation projects. We're working on piloting a project in Mumbai where we're taking public toilets, right, and we are using various technologies to improve. And later we want to connect all public toilets in Mumbai.
Hi everyone, I'm Martin Walter. I work for an industry analyst firm called Frost & Sullivan, and we do a lot of research in the smart cities field. So we're particularly interested in commercially sustainable
we're putting air quality sensors on existing transport networks. So they are mobile sensors, and the idea is to get a very precise and cost-effective way to map the air quality around the city.
Hi everyone, my name is Nicklin. I'm here with OpenPlay. Basically, we're creating a marketplace for sports facilities and activity to try and solve the physical and activity problem in the UK that costs the NHS 35 billion, and the problem of public facilities that are going to waste. So we're using mobile apps like Beacon to try and get people, incentivize people to get active and get use of these facilities.
Hi, I'm Andrea. I'm from AIM Technology. We produce Fergie, which is a photocatalytic paint. When in contact with light, it produces a level of pollution and bacteria in the environment. And painting 1 square meter with our lead is equivalent of 1 square meter of forest or trees. So I'm curious in solutions for your application, basically in this case.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Dominic Vito from BTI Strategy Partners, and at its simplest, we're all about getting your business strategy on one single page of A4, so that you know what your vision is, your purpose, aligned to your values, like the long-term strategy with the numbers that you need to be measuring the KPIs, so that you know what you're doing in every month. Because the entrepreneurs typically, they're really good at something, and they focus on that, and they forget about the rest of the business. So we're making sure that everyone has clarity on where they're going. So that's Dominic from BTI Strategy Partners.
My name is Francis. I'm writing a book at the moment about innovation, so if anybody's got anything in particular they know about Goodson, Borglum, Rhinus Mickles, or Mary Curie,
Great, thank you very much, everyone. An unusual start to a panel session. Just 3 more introductions, if I can. We'll start with you, Priya. Could you just spend a minute or so telling us a bit about yourself and Changify? Yeah.
Sure. So hello, everybody. It's great to see such a big audience at this time. I'm Priya Prakesh from Design for Social Change, and we are an urban innovation company which basically brings big data and active citizen participation to improve public infrastructure in real time. So the way I started Changify is I'm a cyclist in London, and I've been cycling for 15 years. I had a bad cycle accident. I tried to fix the streets outside my house. I used Fix My Street. I called up my councillor. I went through all the traditional channels that citizens use in order to create a small change, and was very hard. And given my background in mobile technology, I worked at Nokia designing phones. I worked on the first version of iPlayer. I wanted to bring a systems approach in how Joe blogs or Jane blogs walking down the street could make a change. And that's how I started Changify.
Yeah, I'm Josh Nicklin from Masabi. Masabi is a mobile ticketing platform company. We work with transport operators globally to help their riders purchase tickets on their mobile and use their mobile to travel. We do this with a platform called Just Ride. We solve a 2-sided problem for our customers. That is, for the end user, buying a public transport ticket is often a difficult affair, that it really shouldn't be a difficult affair, so allowing you to purchase and use your mobile to travel is pretty straightforward. And the equipment that is used to sell and validate traditional tickets is very expensive for transport operators. So we help solve their problem by putting the hardware away from in-stations and on buses into customers' phones, reducing the cost of sale for them. We work on a pretty global basis, so we've got a number of customers here in the UK, ones you'd have heard of, such as Virgin Trains, National Express, Arriva, etc. And on a more global basis, we have deployments in Athens, in the Netherlands, France, as well as about 10 to 15 in the US, big cities like Boston and New York.
Hey everyone, my name's Tom Mursell, although my name badge, in my haste I think I wrote Tom Mursell, comma, so I'm slightly askew. But anyway, I look after growth partnerships at What 3 Words. Some of you may have heard of us. What we are is a global addressing system. We have divided the world into 3 meter squares, and for every single one of the 57 trillion squares, we've given a unique address to, and the address is comprised of 3 dictionary words. So for example, index home raft. So we've done this globally in 15 different languages. Why, you ask? Well, the world is very poorly addressed. UN reports cite about 4 billion people that don't have a street address or a geocodable street address they can search on a map. In the UK, we have local addressing challenges too, so trying to identify things that don't have a street address or where a street address is not precise enough. So our technology is used by organizations including the United Nations on the one hand, through to postal agencies, couriers, navigation and consumer apps too.
Great. Well, thank you to all three of you. I'm going to start with you, Josh, for no other reason than I think you guys are the largest of the three companies. So we'll start there. I think I'm right in saying that you've raised over 20 million US to date as a company.
Yep.
If you could you just go back to the start and talk a bit about Masabi's first contract, how it grew from there, and a bit about when you started considering internationalization and looking at overseas markets?
Yeah, sure. So I kind of see Masabi as having three parts to its evolution. Masabi actually started as an agency, building one-off bespoke products for brands like Coca-Cola, Lloyd's, but they all had, they were all underpinned by payments and security expertise, which the founders possess, I guess, as software developers. So initially building applications in that space, all dedicated around mobile, and this was in the early 2000s, so this is pre-iPhone. But in around 2007, Masabi won a pilot contract with Chiltern Railways, who operates between London and Birmingham to run a mobile ticketing trial. And rather than approach that as a one-off bespoke project, actually positioned it as utilising a platform that Masabi has, which they then went and built for Chiltern Railways, and then were able to sell to a large number of UK train operating companies. So in the UK, there are about 20 train operating companies. Today, Masabi serves 11 of those with our mobile ticketing product. So if you purchase a mobile ticket from an operator in the UK, you probably do it on one of our apps. The third phase of Masabi was really around that international growth, which started in the US and has continued on from there. And that really came about because of the limitations of the UK market. It was recognising that buying a ticket as a customer in the UK is confusing and complex because the systems and the standards that underpin ticketing in the UK are complex. So what we wanted to do was to look into markets where you remove the complexity, and the US being the first of those actually solves that problem quite nicely, because whereas in the UK a lot of travel is all about interoperability, the US is actually much more made up of lots of little islands, which are the cities and the transportation systems that feed them. So it was a much better short-term fit for Masabi.
Sure. And I mean, US is obviously a very large market.
Yeah.
Was it a very easy decision to choose that as your first overseas market? I mean, you're taking on the big guys there, aren't you?
Well, actually, yes and no. So it was an easy decision insofar as you know, when you're looking to scale internationally, you know, there's a few different obstacles you need to overcome. The first of which is language, and in that regard, the US is a lot more straightforward than other places you might look. Then you've got to look at, sorry, train of thought's gone. Yeah, so product market fit and
size of the market.
Sorry, yeah. Okay. So yeah, sorry, completely lost my train of thought there. Okay, so in the UK, there's a lot of private operators that run public transport. In the US, it's run by city transportation authorities, and as a result, they're actually a lot further behind the UK in terms of innovation. They're a lot slower to change. And so what we've done is we've built a very deep credibility in offering mobile ticketing services to UK companies who were really focused on innovation. When we came to the US, it was all brand new to them. And so we were able to be the English company that was very mature, rather than be the sort of the startup company which transportation authorities, government organisations actually implicitly don't trust.
Sure, great. Tom, you've obviously got a whole range of clients, perhaps if I can say a lot broader set of clients than Masabi. What 3 words? Could you just give us a bit of context about where you guys started, what your first couple of contracts looked like, and
sure.
how you started taking that overseas?
So I mean, the reason the company came about was one of our co-founders, Chris Sheldrick. He used to be in the music industry, so his job was basically to get music artists who at the best of times are fairly nonchalant about travel and especially going to the middle of a field in Eastern Europe to play at a music festival. And oftentimes these places didn't have addresses, and of course has been highlighted language barriers, particularly with addressing in our case. And so Chris started using GPS coordinates to communicate to the logistics professionals, the people delivering the equipment, and the music artists themselves to say, this is where you should be going. But with anyone that's not perhaps geospatially minded, or for that matter isn't really familiar with GPS coordinates, it's very, very easy to make mistakes without realizing. But mixing up a couple of numbers could end you up, perhaps a mile to 10 miles away from where your intended destination is. So Chris approached a mathematician friend who came up with a really, really simple way of effectively addressing this, if you excuse the pun, which was using words instead of numbers, because human beings communicate in words, of course, rather than numbers, much easier for us to understand and use. So that's a bit about the a potted history as to where it came about from. So in terms of where we are as an organization, I mean, we don't focus on one sector per se, although we have sort of 4 or 5 areas that we know are pretty critical and need our service. But of all the 195 countries in the world, everyone suffers with location challenges to one extent or another. So we needed to be pretty global from the start, and because we have addressed the world quite literally, we have a solution for anyone that has a location challenge. But in terms of where we actually decided to focus on, we looked at, really as a business-to-business consumer organization, looked at markets that would deliver us consumer growth and scale, because ultimately we want people using 3-word addresses, although we're not the solution in itself, we're an ingredient. So that is things like big navigation applications, it's big travel and tourism apps, it's logistics professionals, all of these types of organizations. So we looked at that plus the languages we started with, which in the early days were English, French, Spanish. And so we looked at markets that had and sort of correlated with both large consumer audiences needed this plus language development. And so naturally it's areas like Latin America. And in fact, one of the earliest clients we had was in the favelas in Rocinha, where there's what is the largest favela, but a community in a place called Rocinha, home to about 70,000 people. And out of 11 million people that live in favelas in Brazil, including the folks in Rocinha, they don't have access to core things like postal services because there are no geocodable addresses. You can't stick an address into Google Maps, for example, and be found in these areas. And for both political and security reasons, the government postal service, the Correios, don't deliver within these areas. And so one of our first clients was actually a group called Carteiro Amigo, who are a private postal operator that basically pick up where the Correios or the postal service leave off. As they deliver door to door, and they effectively, as was pretty serendipitously, they wrote a piece about addressing in the favelas and how they wanted to tackle this problem just as we were launching. And so we got in touch with them, and a plane ride later, they decided to roll out What 3 Words for all of their citizens. Started.
Great. So it seems as though sort of using your existing resources, a lot of the work that you've put in to grow nationally is a great sort of foundation from then which to grow internationally, if that's what I'm hearing. Priya, you've got a slightly different business model, if I can. Obviously, you engage citizens in a far different, in a different kind of way. They're not just customers, are they? They're part of your organisation, part of your business. Could you tell us a bit about how you've grown? In telling us a bit about how you've grown, talk a bit about how the fact that citizens are part of your model is dictated or affected how you've grown your business?
Sure, Fergie. So I actually started in the opposite way. I started internationally, so I was a part of an accelerator called Hubrom, which was set up by Deutsche Telekom, and I set myself in Berlin instead of setting myself in London. Because I was self-funded, I wanted to keep the costs low. Also, my tech team was from Berlin, and I think you get some of the best tech team there instead of paying the London prices. So I still am relying on my tech team in Berlin. The business model is an interesting one because with all due respect, citizen engagement is still seen as a cost, it's not seen as a revenue, and it's only seen as an afterthought for compliance sake for many traditional consultation-based approaches. So one of the things that helped me by basing myself in Berlin is I got quite close to the Cisco team who were doing lots of smart city projects, and they had noticed that there was a core problem of stakeholder engagement in the beginning of a smart city project, which typically means a lot of people like us in a room, whether they're tech, policy, or community organizations, trying to create a roadmap for a particular project in a local area, and it's extremely hard for these people to have a conversation because people have different levels of digital literacy or following the same kind of goals, KPIs. So working together with Cisco, so Cisco was our partner, we came up with the first toolkit which was called Citizen Canvas.
Were they a partner from the accelerator or?
From the accelerator
Okay.
itself. And they allowed us to come on board for the Smart City project in Hamburg, where we got to pilot an approach whereby we had a living lab in this neighborhood called Schonze, and we were working with the Hamburg City Council, and we also used this toolkit for people to come up with the first level of crowd-funded services. So that kind of gave us an understanding of how you would do like both enterprise-based community engagement for enterprises, and at the same time embed yourself on a local neighborhood level. So once we had done this, we also did this in Barcelona. My approach was to go to different cities, having used my own neighborhood as a lab, because I was running my local business network, I was part of the community organizations. I found it was useful to take that approach to different cities and work with universities, work with people who are starting or embarking on smart city projects, come in as a partner, and that business model was much more on a consultancy basis and a license model for the Citizen Canvas itself for more use. After we did that for a while, we realized that for us to scale up, we really had to work with somebody like a service contractor who had contracts in multiple cities. So we applied for Innovate UK Connected Cities Challenge and won it. And I think actually is a colleague from Ferrovia Cities of Center for Excellence here. I think I've seen her name here. We're working with Amy Ferrovia in a pilot now in the city of Plymouth to actively get road users engaged to help improve the road infrastructure. And that business model is basically on the basis of the pilot, we will be able to get the contract going. But at the same time, we used the same platform and approached city of Singapore, Malaysia, and Shanghai. So we are right now in advanced conversations with the city of Shanghai. We are the only UK developer to have won this contract discussion out of 10 other Chinese companies for solving the road and traffic safety issues. So the reason I think, even though I started in 2013, we are part of the Mayor's High Growth Business Program as a scale-up. I think one of the things is if you're following a customer revenue-based model, not taking a EU funding model or taking like VC funding, I think you'll have to probably start small and use the same platform in multiple places to create enough use cases so that you can use that data to show that, yes, there is a business model behind it.
Sure, sure. It's interesting to hear how you started off with a channel partner such as Cisco. You then went out and used your own network and lead generated off your own back, and then came back to looking at other support networks, and now have a hybrid model where sometimes you do it yourself or sometimes you work with channel partners or support networks.
I forgot to mention a key thing, which is the trade mission. So this year, I focused a lot from a business development activity to go to 3 connected cities trade missions, which was organized by Innovate UK. So we went in March to Singapore, Malaysia, and then went to the China one, and now recently to India one. Because I realized when you're selling to cities, you as a small SME cannot approach the government. It's easier to go with a government delegation who has the connections that can open the doors, and I think that was one of the most successful ways of doing business development overseas.
Okay, great. Josh, coming back to you, I think Boston was your first US city, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
I was going to ask you a bit about the how you reached out to them using the Americanism. And if you could, just talk a bit about, describe the process, from there. We at EIT Digital, we see a lot of startups that are in the process of systemizing their business development, but still haven't developed a playbook or a template or something like that. Could you talk a bit about the sort of Boston experience and sort of mechanically how that went about and how you won the business?
Yeah, absolutely. So as we started looking at the US market, we wanted to go to a number of trade shows just to get a feel for what the atmosphere around this kind of product would be. Went to trade shows, started speaking to transport authorities, and what we were able to bring back was exactly what we hoped, was that they were experiencing similar problems than we came across in the UK, but actually magnified a lot of the time. Boston particularly was a chance meeting over a dinner at one of these events, and it was actually the CFO for the Transportation Authority was lamenting how he was about to spend $70 million on extending a smart ticketing system from the city centre out to the commuter rail system. Huge capital expenditure, and it was all to solve one problem, which was people paying on credit cards in the sort of outer stations, same as you get here in the UK. No vending machines, no facilities. So,
just to jump in, I mean, obviously that's one conversation. How many conversations do you think it took to find that one? And I mean, how do you manage what conversations you have? I mean, obviously, being a startup, resource is one of your largest constraints. So, how do you know or find out where to speak to? I mean, obviously, delegations and trade shows provide a great environment for that.
Yeah. So trade shows, I'd say, has been our biggest lead generator to date. Consistently, I'd say 70% of the activity and the opportunities that we deal with come from trade shows. And that's a lot of repetition, a lot of dealing with new opportunities. Sometimes you need to take a chance. One of our investors and biggest customers is a French-based transport operator. We went to a French trade show with English banners, turned up, realised we were the only English-speaking people at this trade show. It was what started off as an absolute disaster, ended up with an investor and one of our biggest customers. Those are the way these things happen sometimes. So that's what I'd say. Trade shows can be a bit of hit and miss, a bit of luck. That's about building your network, building your reputation. Then from the more automated side, we do have a lot of marketing automation work that we do. We've got a pretty deep content marketing strategy that helps breed a lot of inbound activity through our web activity. So we've kind of got a two-pronged strategy there in terms of the marketing that we do. In terms of actual sales, in terms of a playbook, it's not straightforward. Our sales cycle is typically about 2 years. So from first contact to contract close, it's 2 years. New York, for example, we basically were speaking to them the day I joined. We went live early this year, some 5.5 years later. So, we really can have very, very long sales cycles. So it's much more about relationship buildings, really getting to know their problems, getting to know the stakeholders, than it is about a straightforward SaaS playbook where you've got, 2 phone calls, close. It's not that straightforward.
Sure. And a lot of the systems that you developed in the UK, were they, I mean, you talk about localization, was there any friction there when using them for Boston in terms of the opportunity nurturing process and getting a deal on the table and looking how to close that?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that we rebuilt our platform for the international market. And that was actually less about it being international. We've resold that platform into the UK. It was more about appealing to a different type of system, whereby instead of sort of being a mobile app on top of someone else's back office, we built the full end-to-end stack. And so that has helped us really reach out. So really our credibility was from our UK base of customers, but our international growth has been underpinned by actually a completely different platform. But we wouldn't have been able to have had that growth without the original platform.
Sure. Tom, with a sort of far more varied type of client in lots of different verticals, I imagine your sales cycles can be very short or can be very long. Could you talk a bit about how, after that first lead and first overseas contract that you mentioned earlier, how you then followed up on that and how you started putting systems in place to do business overseas and to do business internationally?
Sure. I mean, we're somewhat fortunate in as much as most of what we're doing is inbound. So, we've got consumer apps tools that are effectively harvesting lots and lots of user data. So basically people signing up, people that may not necessarily realize the full scale of what we offer. So for example, the chief executive of a postal agency may download our free consumer app. So then it's a case of sort of cross-pollinating and saying, hang on, this is what we do for postal agencies as well. But to answer the question, what we did with in the case of the favelas. Now, Proof is really sort of our biggest marketing tool. So we take lots and lots of case studies, implementation guides, really work with sort of the partner to ascertain how they're using us and document that. And in the case of the favelas, actually, I mean, it's a very PRable story. So it ended up on the BBC News homepage. one of the trending features there and was sort of spread across other news websites. And so that, whilst it may seem, fairly small in its own right, sort of 70,000 people with an address, ultimately, through a series of iterations, that progresses to the other side of the world and the fairly larger courier adopting us, and then goes through several other cycles. And this year we announced our first postal service integration in Mongolia, and an investor and one of our biggest global carriers to date now, Aramex, $1 billion Arabic courier, investing in us and adopting our technology. So even those really small early deals, if you can sort of leverage them correctly, get the right, get the right content in place, and really sort of identify the proof, case studies, facts, then extrapolate that across other markets and other place, and it really sort of snowballs.
Sure. And do you manage a lot of those leads or opportunities here from the UK, or do you have people on the ground overseas? Are they directly employed? Are they partners? Are they contractors?
Yeah, there's a real mix. So we've experimented. I'm sure many of you are sort of either in the process of experimenting, maybe further along, or at a lesser stage than us. But we've played around with lots of different models. What we've sort of settled on is that we need an international presence, although the sort of powerhouse of the technology is in London, so about 25 people here. But we have, for example, a member of staff now in Mongolia because we've got such a groundswell that we need someone to represent us there, and the cultural nuances, the language, the time difference, just to manage all of those things, we need a presence. But our model really is, because we're not building solutions, we're just simply making technology available via SDKs, APIs, and so on, to enable others to do it. We'd far rather deal with, in terms of scale and scaling, far rather deal with local partners who have that sort of local expertise, both geographically and also sector expertise, which we don't even profess to have, and we just simply make them experts in what 3 words, so they can marry all of that stuff together and represent us on the ground. So you've got sort of various degrees of what that looks like. On the one hand, we've got technology that's completely self-service, so anyone on a practical note can sign up for the API and just start integrating what 3 words into their apps. Right through to country-level distributors that sort of really represent our interests in those countries. So, for example, in Korea, we're soon to launch the Korean language. It really makes sense for us to work with one partner there that represents all Korean opportunities, who we work pretty closely with in a very integrated way. So we're sort of still evolving that. We don't have the right answer just yet, but we sort of feel like, this sort of hybrid of someone who's employed by us in a country, plus managing local partners and distributors is the right model for us.
Okay, great. Listening to both of you speak, you talk a lot about inbound. And outbound sales is a very sort of push type of network effect that you're trying to create. Inbound pull and using marketing is a very different type of sort of strategy, as it were. And you tend to pick up, from my understanding at least, you tend to have customers who have very different profiles as well, perhaps. Priya, could you talk a bit about how you use outbound and inbound? Obviously, the engagement and activation side of what you do is, I imagine, very key to that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Fergie. So I want to just echo what Josh and Sam were talking about, because I think that's spot on. If you're talking about scaling up internationally, for us as well, it's an API-based approach. It's not a solution. And I think that also comes down to the engagement for the inbound and the outbound, because many smart city solutions, I was talking to Gemma earlier in the Smart City Expo, we're always looking for a problem. There's all these solutions and they don't know what the problem is to solve. And I think going back to what 3 was just said as well, if you have a technology and you know that it's ultimately the integration partner, the local partner who's going to be applying that and customizing it to their needs, then you need a very different kind of a marketing approach. For me, what has really worked well is, one is the thought leadership part. So obviously taking part in panels like this, being part of some of the conference circuit, because citizen-centric is still seen as something as an aspiration. It's only now that the business model is changing around this kind of tech first and now citizens first. So doing a lot of the talking and then having the right kind of exposure in different kind of newspapers, whether that's the FT or the Times, you're very lucky to get that. And then maintaining a kind of a CRM system. I should confess I'm still struggling with this. I'm not a Salesforce fan or a Salesforce geek. But every time coming back from the expo, like coming back from the Smart City Expo, and then having a kind of a decent spreadsheet where you can qualify your leads and then have like a traffic light system where you can decide whether a particular person you spoke to is the right in the beginning of the project, so you can strike it when it's hot, versus something where the RFQ has already been set and you're probably one more person applying for a tender. So that's probably not the best place for you to sit and invest your energy. So just kind of creating that kind of qualification after going for an event is quite useful. Also finding third-party partners whose API you can talk to. So typically when you're looking at citizen engagement, a lot of cities are also looking for citizen security. That's not our core focus. So I've tied up recently with a company called Aralia Systems who actually provides CCTV security services, and their platform and my API can talk to each other, so suddenly we have a hybrid model, and this has become quite successful when we are speaking in conjunction with different cities. So for me it's been a combination of maintaining this Google spreadsheet kind of a thing, just for my own due diligence as biz dev, and then following up with public discussions and public thought leadership.
Sure. That sort of brings us on to nicely to sort of talking a bit about remote management. Obviously, if you're working with lots of different cities and lots of different people in a very distributed manner, that's very different to working with in an office where everyone's under one roof. Could you talk a bit about how what techniques or strategies you've used and to manage all these different projects that are involved in remotely?
Sure. So I confess, having worked in a large corporate where all my teams are remote, so I was managing at least 75, 80 people in 5, 6 different countries. That way of working has been something I'm familiar with. But I think one thing that matters are the collaboration tools. So like in the UK, I have one set of developers based in Yorkshire. We use Trello for managing our backlog. I have another 2 developers in Berlin. So we try and do one of the key things on the development side is how do you synchronize the time zones and synchronize the backlogs together. On the marketing and business development side, I've just been a bit more strategic where I have a local partner in each country. So in India, I do have having also come from the same country, I do know which people I need to tie up with who become my business development arm. Same for China, we're tying up with Digital China and ZTE, who would resell our solution to the cities where they're doing e-governance based things. So I don't need to spend any money. They will do it for me. So it's basically trying to find those strategic partnerships where as long as you can manage your development remotely, but let the business development marketing being taken care by local partners, I think as a small company you can scale up.
Sure. So Josh and Tom, I mean, could you follow that up and talk a bit about how you hire locally, how you select vendors locally? I mean, that's the start of the remote management process, I guess, in a way. So sort of procurement, selection, and then what kind of sort of quality controls or incentivizations you use for the global teams that you work with?
Yeah. So Masabi has a total biz dev team size of 6. 2 based in the UK, 2 based in the US, and then 2 in satellite offices, i.e. their bedrooms, in Europe. Hiring-wise, we have focused on hiring experienced people, senior people who are very sector knowledgeable and specific. So we tend to hire people who have experience in fare collection systems and selling those into that market, just because it's a relatively small world, and if you've been able to sell a big solution into a transport organisation, chances are you'll relish the opportunity of selling a software service into a transport organisation. So that's what we've seen so far. So in terms of hiring, that's been the profile of candidate we've looked for. Managing them, we do use Salesforce. We combine Salesforce with HubSpot to help us manage the inbound activity that we get, keep an eye on the people who are engaging with our content. So we've always got a pretty good map of how our leads are engaging with Masabi as a company online. And then we use Salesforce to capture and report back to the C-level group on how we're tracking against our targets for that year. So we have certainly software tools that help, and then it's very much because it's a senior group, we do work quite well as a team in terms of helping support each other on activities. I'm fortunately based in the UK, so we're able to help manage the technical team support on bids. And then in terms of RFP activity, because we operate in a very specific niche, we can very quickly identify if an opportunity is right or not, and then it's about supporting them and getting translated copy, etc. for submission.
Okay, great. What about you?
Sure. Okay. So in terms of how we actually select partners, I mean we've sort of we've got this partner program which is sort of in the nascent stages right now, but really it's trying to cater to anyone that wants to use our technology. And so we have this completely self-serve model, which is absolutely fine. We don't need to vet anyone that wants to use the API in the same way if you went and played with Google Maps API or any other API for that matter. So there's the self-service approach. Anyone that wants to go above and beyond that and wants to see, as we do see quite often, people who'd like to represent us in a particular country or sector, and they want some sort of badge that says they are a What 3 Words consultant or they're a What 3 Words approved, we've sort of created this almost like bespoke consultancy type program called ASC, which and dealing with certain parts of the world, things like anti-corruption and bribery are pretty paramount, and we need them to sign up to our policies. We can't just say, hey, go ahead and represent What 3 Words. So there is a level of due diligence that goes into that, but it also gives them access to just using our technology and integrating it and playing around with it in certain projects. Then in terms of distributors and employees, we're really pretty strict because there's fairly few of them, and in terms of, I mean, if you look at, the team 25 in the UK, although we're hiring like mad, we're very selective about who we do hire because we only need to really get to a certain stage. We don't need to double the team, to double user numbers, to double everything else, or the other metrics. Really, it's about growing that partner program and enabling people. So for us, what's more key is getting the right, not one-size-fits-all approach, but making the technology, documentation, pretty much everything as accessible as possible, and empowering people on the ground to start using our tech.
Okay, great. I'm going to open it up to the floor in a bit, so I hope you're thinking of some questions. Just to go along the line, I was going to ask about sort of your biggest challenges that you faced in doing business overseas, whether setting up or execution, and perhaps at the same time talk about some of the things that worked really well that were perhaps a bit unexpected. Priya, are you okay to start with that?
So I think the things that I personally suck at is converting a lead into a contract. Because I can talk a lot, but it's about what my mama says, like, cut the chase. So I find it as a founder, because that's not my strength of actually converting. So I've been trying a lot to improve myself in a business development perspective on how can you actually move the conversation, you can get to the business contract itself. Having said that, I've recently been meeting, I'm actively looking for non-executive directors. So if any of you are interested, I'm hoping to create a board of people who have, coming from a sales experience, could advise me, because I'm more of a design product person. So those are the two things. And the things that really worked well is when I went to these overseas trade missions, I met a lot of the people from DIT, which was previously UKTI, and they have been almost like the business development arm. Like, there is LC Yim from Singapore, there are a bunch of people in Malaysia who have continued the conversation even after we've met up with the clients. So I think it's about creating those relationships. I think somebody's already Josh mentioned that. Having a personal one-to-one relationship where somebody else takes care of your back and wants to do work together with you is what has helped me a lot.
Okay, great.
Sure, so what's been difficult, I think, was the starting point. And I think it's in a way, it's trying to do too much. We found that as soon as we'd expanded from the UK to the US, we got a flood of activity from an inbound perspective in Europe. And there's an immediate desire to say, yeah, let's sign up customers all across Europe, look like a global company, brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. But the reality hits quite quickly where you've got language and translation issues. They exist, but they're relatively simple to overcome. It's actually all the little nuances of entering a new country that you might forget. Little integrations, customizations that are required. For us, sort of underpinning everything we do is the payments layer. And you'd be surprised how many very specific payment methods there are in different countries. The Netherlands has a bank-to-bank transfer system called Ideal that 70% of online transactions use. And that's a platform that if you're a Dutch-based company, well, of course you integrate with Ideal, but as a UK company going over there, suddenly there's this expensive integration to undertake. So, there's kind of I think if we were to have done it again, would have been a bit more selective and aggressive over particular markets rather than just sort of going gung-ho with every inbound opportunity we got. But I think to counterbalance that, where have we been happy with? I came from a marketing background personally and have transitioned into sales. And for me personally, there was kind of this thing of being a small company. It was every meeting you get the marketing person, the CEO, and those are the people who go out there and speak to people. And I was doing sales before I knew it. And you know, there's kind of that adage of the more I practice, the luckier I got. And for ages I was like, well, I'm pretty lucky at this. But I think that the nice thing is that it's actually something that you do practice at, you do get better at, your network builds, and that's been really positive for us.
Okay, great.
Sure, I think one of the key challenges we face in terms of actually talking about the product, localization, and for that means translating the language. So we've got 57 trillion addresses, or slightly less actually, in other languages. Things like when we were releasing Arabic, you know, removing alcoholic words from the word list so it's not culturally offensive, and slightly changing the logo perhaps, because actually what 3 words in Arabic doesn't translate very well. So I think it's addressing 3 words. And you know, there are cultural nuances like that, and in terms of the product localization. But if you take the time to make the effort, as we did with, for example, Swahili, which, you know, on the face of it doesn't seem like a very rational language to go and launch fairly early on, but we did. And so then when you're on the ground in Nairobi or Dar es Salaam or wherever you are in East Africa, actually the fact that you've gone about from London and developed a Swahili version of an application for people in East Africa, they're completely bowled over, because not many companies actually do that and go to such great extents. And so then what follows is almost a demonstration of intent and commitment to that particular country or territory. And so then user growth, revenue opportunities, and so on follow. The other thing that's kind of a challenge but also interesting is that you quite often don't know where conversations will lead. And so on the face of it, you're talking to someone who it may not, you know, from a purely commercial perspective, not really make much sense you speaking to this person. But then all of a sudden, they turn around and say, oh, my husband is the chief executive of this, or my third cousin is, you know, runs this particular postal division, or whatever it may be. You never really know, particularly where, and looking at our Salesforce engine, which I'm lucky enough to administer, looking at the data that we're trying to populate about users, it's very, very scant in certain countries. Whereas in the UK, everyone's on LinkedIn if you're, you know, in business and particularly ambitious. It's pretty easy to identify who people are and pull in APIs to automatically populate that data. It's not really the same when you're going into sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America. And so actually building a picture about who a person is difficult. And so you then have to have those conversations to establish who they are, what their interests are, and subsequently who their network is and how you can grow within that. So I'd say those are the 2 biggest bits.
Yeah, well, localization is something that we focus on very strongly at EIT Digital, and it's not just technical as well as, you know, business is done in different ways in different parts of the world and in different parts of Europe as well. Have I got any questions here? We've got about another 5 or 10 minutes or so, and I'm keen for you guys to have a shout as well. Yeah.
We've had some other advice when it comes to internationalization, and that almost by keeping your website and information in English, it almost builds a certain level of respect that you've come from the UK, you must be an established business. It gives you some gravitas when going to external markets. Have you found that at all?
I mean, I can answer that to some extent. I think it depends on your buyer profile. So for us, we tend to find that the senior people within transport organisations are English-speaking, well-educated, and so the buyer profile tends to be C-level for our kind of product, and so English content mostly works pretty well. Spain's a bit of an anomaly there. They very much want Spanish language work. If you're going for more of a bottom-up sell, then I think you might want to think about localization. You know, in our kinds of organisations, you're looking at bus drivers, customer service staff. They tend to be more local, and so if you were trying to get a buyer profile at that level, you might want to have a more localized content.
This is for Josh. You seem to have perfected the model of trade shows. So do you have some advice for us as to how to run these trade shows?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always do your best to be on a panel or some kind of speaking slot. That gives you the person who people gravitate towards. You know, there's an element of thought leadership that is really important. You can't just be a bystander in the conversation. You've got to be active in the conversation. So that's sort of how you lead into the conference side. And then it's about not just doing one, but finding your niche. The more general the event, the less successful it tends to be. So go hyper niche and go big in those hyper niches. So for us, our biggest event by far is Transport Ticketing London. That is, you probably wouldn't even think that event exists, but it does, and of course that does great for us. Then the next layer up, you've got IT in transportation, then again you've got general transportation events. We get 10 times the leads from that niche event, Transport Ticketing London, than we do from the big global smart cities events, such as the one in Barcelona last week. So that would be my sort of two things. Make sure you're visible and in the conversation, and going hyper niche, and make sure you do it every single year so people see you again and again and again.
Could I answer that as well? One of the things we found successful was going after the events that the C-level type execs were actually present at, and usually, as we've learned, that tends to be the events that have an awards attached to them, because there's this level of ego that people just want to go there to pick up an award, and I think some of them are actually run for that purpose. But anyway, we found those more successful rather than the general trade shows. But again, it depends on your buyer profile. The other thing that's really interesting is just setting up, in our case, we have a Zapier API that fetches all Twitter hashtags and collects all data and stores it all, and posts it to Slack, and also stores it in Google Sheets and Salesforce. So basically we have a big picture of the whole conversation that's going on. So even if we miss the 90% of visitors, 95% of visitors, we still have a record of who's talking about the event. So at a later date we can say, hey, we didn't catch you at the event, but, and then obviously that segues into a conversation.
Yep.
That's a question. How much of your business is actually international? So how much of your revenues are from international business as compared to UK business? Just a quick figure.
I would say 100% for me.
100%?
Yeah.
About 80%.
Probably 95, yeah.
Brexit.
Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, the question on this is probably very difficult to answer in generic terms, but so how long did it take to kind of figure out what your international was, to understand who your point person was, to understand how to do business safely, who was the person you could trust, right to the point that you actually got secured your first deal? Just a rough sense of the time involved from the idea of being in your head, deciding what you're going to do it, to actually securing your first contract.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the key things I realized, things in the UK were taking so long for me. The sales cycles are quite long, and I was running out of cash flow, so I had to actively just go to countries where I know that first there was a requirement for citizen engagement, and they were working on smart city projects, so there was always already investment there. It was not that we were proposing something new. So the first contract that we signed was in South Korea with Samsung, and it was basically working on the IoT platform itself. And the reason I used my existing network, putting my old mobile tech hat on to go through my old clients, my old colleagues or clients, and actively go and work in Palo Alto in the US and work in Seoul, and then test the waters through people who had worked with previously in foreign territories. And through that, I managed to set up the initial relationships. And then I went on these trade missions like the ones we went to at Barcelona ourselves, becoming part of the Mayor's High Growth Business Program, but going regularly to the Smart City Expo, and then becoming part of the Innovate UK trade missions, and becoming familiar with the DIT or the UKTI staff, so they know what you're doing and they can talk on your behalf, helped a lot. So having done that for, I would say, 18 months to 2 years, now people know what D4SC does. I mean, you did, but now you hopefully do. And they started becoming that connector for other opportunities in overseas markets.
One of the things, no one wants to be the first to buy something, or at least no one wants to be seen to be the first. Well, hang on, no, there is a contrary argument to that, which is people do want to say they want to be the first, but in practice people don't, and they're looking for social proof. So one of the things, if you've got long sales cycles, which sounds like Priya you do and we do in certain areas, is find the ambitious innovators and the people that have kind of no solution whatsoever, and offer them something, even if it's pretty light touch, document it and get it out there. So they are using it, but maybe they're not the ideal client. And so that could be, it could be, for example, a secondary city in, a country that probably can't afford to doesn't have the same purchasing power as the UK, Europe, or the US. But find those ambitious innovators. So you've got the case studies, you've got something to bolster a proposition when you do go in and sell to the bigger guys. And ultimately, you're still making progress whilst you're engaged in conversations with the bigger players.
Yeah, I would agree with that entirely. That ambitious innovator is exactly how we entered Boston. Again, Boston Boston is the sort of the smaller brother to New York, and New York would never happen without Boston first, and Boston wants to be the innovator. So as an authority, it was the ambitious innovator, and then we found the ambitious innovator within that organisation to really push the opportunity through. And especially if you're dealing with public sector, and the US being a prime example of this, these are often jobs for lifers. Their job is to not get fired because the pension is great and they can retire at 50 and don't do anything stupid. So finding that one individual, if you're dealing with a committee in your first opportunity outside of the UK, you're probably not going to find the sale. You need to identify that one individual who's going to drive it through their organisation and really want to make a change because they're overly ambitious compared to the typical person within those kinds of organisations.
Sure, I think that's a really strong point to make. How do you then support that business champion within an organisation? Because he's got to go out and win hearts and minds on your behalf. So, do you think very carefully about how you support perhaps different people in different types of organisations? And is it just one stakeholder or multiple stakeholders?
Yeah, you need to nurture the whole stakeholder group, but really partner with that individual who's going to ultimately either be the ultimate decision maker, and you can tell that they're the right characters to make that decision, or the person who's going to drive that change. We support them typically through content, so we have a range of case studies, a range of market white papers and thought leadership pieces that really they can use to help strengthen their arguments internally. So it sounds like that's similar to what you guys have done as well. That content sounds really obvious, but it is so important.
I would just add a strategic thing. It's also about managing upwards. So it's not the immediate person you're working with, but it's their boss. So one of the things that worked well for us is when we are having any press coverage, we actively seek the boss's boss to come and give a thought piece as well. So they also feel good that they're part of this pilot or part of this project. It wasn't done on a strategic level, it just happened to be, but it seems to work well where everybody feels great that they're getting a bit of PR and they're feeling like they're being heard, and I think that's quite a nice way of making your way through an organization.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry if I don't mind, Fergie. I mean, one of the things, although people, some folks you're dealing with may not be ambitious or may not have the same goals as you, if you like, there are always folks that have certain ambitions, and it's kind of trying to unravel what they are. So do they want the PR, the recognition internally? Do they want to be seen as an innovator internally? Everyone has a motivation to do something, and it's about supporting that and obviously, helping them along that process. But one of the things that I'm particularly not concerned with, but aware of, is leaving someone exposed if they are your champion, and so you don't want them to put their job at risk. Not that it should get to that state, but for them to be the fall guy, if you like. But if it's as easy as them making the introduction to their boss or someone who is the decision maker, and by nature, virtue of them making that introduction, they have effectively given you some sort of kudos and said these guys are great to speak to. Then it just helps your case, then you pick up the conversation with them, and ultimately you'll be a better person at selling your own proposition, in theory.
Great. I'm going to stop it there, just because we're a few minutes over. I want to thank all three of you, Priya, Josh and Tom. I hope that's given you a bit of an insight how business is done well overseas. It's been great to have you on the panel. Thank you so much. It's hugely appreciated, both from Future Cities Catapult and EIT Digital. If you could just give them a round of applause. Thank you very much.